Bueno, muy buenas tardes por este coloquio. Bienvenida al profesor Martin Hartmann. Déjeme, antes de introducirlo, contarle algo de esta actividad que se inserta en las cátedras de la UAI, que son la columna vertebral, espiritual y filosófica de la universidad, al alero de varios pensadores que son icónicos, que son referentes en las discusiones contemporáneas. La cátedra Alexis de Tocqueville, que me toca dirigir a mí, Leonidas Montes, que es el director de la cátedra Adam Smith, Álvaro Fischer, no está acá con nosotros hoy día, pero es el director de la cátedra Friedrich von Hayek, Iván Jaksic, que dirige la cátedra Bello, Andrés Bello, y Arturo Fontaine, que está fuera de Chile, que dirige la cátedra Edmund Burke. Estas cátedras lo que buscan es invitar, a la luz de las ideas de estos pensadores seminales, cruzarlo con los debates contemporáneos que tenemos sobre la libertad, sobre la democracia, sobre el progreso. Y se cruzan además con el que es el sello quizás distintivo de la Universidad Adolfo Ibáñez, que es su vocación por las humanidades, por las artes liberales, que como ustedes saben es un tronco común, un core curriculum, que es obligatorio para todos los alumnos de ingeniería comercial, de derecho, todo, que tienen que entrar el primer año a leer una caja con 20 libros que se discuten en salas especialmente diseñadas, 20 alumnos. La idea es generar debate, reflexión, pensamiento crítico. Ese es el norte, así que esta actividad se inscribe en esa idea y les damos la muy cordial bienvenida. Déjenme ahora presentar al doctor Martin Hartmann. El doctor Hartmann es full professor en la Universidad de Lucerna, del curso de Filosofía Práctica. Él además es rector de esa universidad, de Lucerna, distinguidísima universidad. Previamente fue decano de la Facultad de Humanidades y Ciencias Sociales y también director de un muy interesante programa, lo conversamos anoche, en filosofía y management. Bien interesante mezcla, ¿no? El profesor Hartmann es doctor en filosofía de la Universidad de Goethe, Frankfurt. Ha sido investigador visitante en prestigiosas universidades como la London School of Economics y en el Graduate Study de la Universidad de Princeton. Es autor de varios libros y hoy día nos va a presentar su último libro, The Feeling of donde nos va a presentar esencialmente una idea de desigualdad basada en la empatía, en las sensaciones, en la percepción que tienen las personas, y como él nos va a relatar, y le recomiendo este libro de Oxford University Press, cuál es su relación, su impacto y su importancia a la luz de las democracias actuales. Así que, profesor Hartmann, le damos la bienvenida. Muchas gracias por estar con nosotros, es un honor. And the floor is yours.
Thank you.
Déjenme explicarles cómo sigue esta sesión. El profesor va a exponer por aproximadamente 40 minutos su obra y luego vamos a tener un espacio de discusión junto a Leonidas Montes, donde vamos a hacer preguntas, conversar con el profesor Hartmann y por supuesto abrir la conversación a ustedes para que hagan las suyas propias. Así que muy bienvenido, profesor.
Thank you. Muchas gracias por invitarme. Me siento muy apreciado. Y voy a cambiar en inglés. Es mejor. So I will try to present not the whole book. That is not possible, but some of its basic ideas in this lecture. And I'm very honored to be here. I did not know that there was something like a Cátedra Alexis de Tocqueville, so I learned a lot already, and I think it's a good idea to have it, actually. I don't know if there is one in Germany or in Switzerland. I don't think so. So I will also try to tell you why I thought that Tocqueville helped me with the book. So I have lots of slides. I'm not going to show you all my slides. This is just the basic structure. I will explain some of my central theoretical claims. Then I will mention why I turned to Tocqueville in some parts of the book, not all over the book. Then I will introduce just one or two scenarios which I use to exemplify and to illustrate my theoretical concepts. I will then introduce some more concepts that are relevant for the book. And in the last part, I will ask what is problematic about what I call empathy gulfs. And I will return to Tocqueville because even in Tocqueville, it's not so easy when you think about the book on revolution in France, what he might have found problematic about the whole historic period that he describes. So just my central theoretical claims, and you don't have to read all this. I will tell you. So it's a book on inequality, and so I begin with social and economic inequalities, and I suggest that these inequalities have an impact on our ability to empathize with others. The book is on inequality and empathy, which is not a common topic. And the idea is that inequalities of various kinds and the distances that go along with them have an impact on our ability to empathize with others, and that empathy as such translates, I say sometimes translates these distances into feelings. It's also a book about feelings. It's about inequality, empathy, and feelings. So that's the main idea, is that inequality is not just an economic relation. It is also, and I would never deny the importance of the economic dimension. That's why I start with social and economic inequalities, but there's more to it. So in the book, I try to show that inequality has many dimensions, and it's not just, it's not enough to reduce inequality to economic inequality. And like, it's okay if you do so, and like Thomas Piketty in his famous book, Capital in the 21st Century, has done so. It's mostly with economic numbers, and he had a powerful impact on public discussions. I try to add to that this dimension of empathy and emotion, and I will try to explain why I think that's important, right? Of course, I have to do that because that's part of my book. So, and to do that and to introduce my basic ideas, I use a lot of vocabulary, and I will introduce some of this vocabulary today. I use, of course, the concept of empathy, and I will say something about what I understand empathy to be. I also use, because empathy in my use is linked with imagination, I will have to say something about imagination. It's also a book, it's the fourth topic, about the role of imagination in, if you want, in social relations at large. Not just in political relations, where it also might be very important, but in social relations at large. I think the way I use empathy is, the way I use empathy and imagination helps me to describe many phenomena that are common in our societies. And I will use these scenarios to explain what I mean by this. So by empathy, just to begin, I don't mean a feeling itself. Very often in everyday language, we take empathy, when we say we empathize with someone, we seem to mean that we feel close to this person, or that we feel pity for this person, that we share feelings with this person. And I don't disagree with that, but the way I use empathy, it is not itself a feeling. It is, as I said, it is a capacity or an ability that transports feelings or translates feelings. So empathy is linked to emotions, and I will show how, but it's not itself an emotion. I think here I follow actually Adam Smith and David Hume. They talk about sympathy, not about empathy. Empathy is the more modern concept. It's an interesting history how sympathy evolved into empathy, but I'm not going to talk about that. But when I say empathy, you can always, if you like, say sympathy in the Smithian and the Humean sense. And Smith and Hume, I think, also did not treat sympathy as a feeling itself. It's a capacity, a human capacity to relate to others via imagination that creates feelings, transports feelings, or as I say, translates feelings. So it's linked to feelings, but it's not itself a feeling. It's important because for my whole project, it's important because in everyday life, when we say we empathize with people, the usual response is, yeah, that's nice, it's important, but you can only empathize with a few people, right? With your friends or your partner or your very close people. Beyond that, it becomes difficult to empathize. The way I use empathy, I want to use it in a broader way. You will see. Yeah? That's a bit maybe a controversial point I'm making. It's a conceptual point, but it's important for me, and I think I follow Smith and Hume, and you can do so. So I will try to show. So that's the central project, right? And I introduced already some of the terminology that is relevant to me. Now, why did I turn to Tocqueville? Now, Tocqueville, I think he is in many of his concepts and the way he analyzes America in Democracy in America and France in the book on the French Revolution, I think are close to the way I use these concepts. I give you just some quotes from Tocqueville, and here you can follow if you want. In Democracy in America, Tocqueville says about the aristocracy, you know, America, when he was there, did not have a very large aristocratic class, not as large as the one in France, but there was still some, you know, under the impact of British society. So he says about aristocracy and Democracy in America, the aristocrats, they do not share the same way of thinking or feeling as everyone else, and they scarcely even think of themselves as belonging to the same humanity. Hence, they cannot fully understand what others feel or judge them on the basis of their own experience. So you can quickly see, I hope, that this is very close to what I'm trying to do. And he uses the same model to analyze American society. So there's a class of people, aristocrats, and because of the way they live and perceive the world, they are separated from the rest. Yeah, even to the extent of saying they don't even feel they're part of the same humanity as other human beings. So the feeling is important. Yeah, it's not just thinking or feeling, and cannot fully understand what others feel or judge. That's what I then call empathy. So they since they live in their own world, in their own separate world, they find it difficult, or so says Tocqueville, to even imagine what it must be like to not be aristocratic, right? So you can maybe see why I found this interesting for my own research. And then there is another comment about the democracy, in America again. And he says here, when ranks in a nation are roughly equal, and everyone thinks and feels in almost the same way, then each person can judge everyone else's sensations in an instant. His imagination instantly puts him in their place. So there you go. Again, my basic idea that imagination plays a central role in Tocqueville's description of American democracy. Now here he talks about democratic or equal society in contrast to the aristocratic elements that he analyzes before, and says in a democracy that is truly equal, people find it much easier to change places in imagination. As we say, to slip into someone's shoes, or just to, as he says, to put oneself in somebody else's place. Yeah, and he stresses imagination, which is what I do so as well. So, so you see why I feel close to Tocqueville. And to add to that, now about the Ancien Régime and the French Revolution, Tocqueville showed a keen awareness of the co-presence of similarities and dissimilarities between the classes in pre-revolutionary France. If you've read the book on the French Revolution, you can see that he says, in a way, pre-revolutionary France was getting more and more similar in various respects, and he says in which respects, but at the same time, the distance between people grew. So he's always describing the co-presence of both phenomena, people becoming more similar, while at the same time becoming more distant. And that is also something that is relevant for my take on social reality. And what links persons, he says in this book, legislation, education, lifestyle, economic standing, approach each other. People grow closer in these respects, and what separates them, it's quite a lot. Geography, taxation, I will talk about taxation, and marriage patterns. Quite interesting. To give you just another quote now from the Ancien Regime and the French Revolution. Here you see, he says, since he's talking about nobles in France, now he's in France, no longer in the US, since he was not subject to the same taxes the peasants were, he could not feel warm sympathy for their plight, which he did not share. This led to what might be called absenteeism of heart. An interesting phrase, absenteeism of heart. Again, you see the same idea that people cannot change position, cannot switch roles in imagination. Here he says, cannot feel warm sympathy for their plight. Again, the idea is the taxation system that the French king or the French kings implemented in the 18th century tore people apart and isolated them in a way that was problematic for what he calls here sympathy. So again, this is, as you can see by now, why I enjoyed reading Tocqueville, why it helped me to analyze the phenomena that I wanted to analyze. And in this book on the French Revolution, here are some of the distances that Tocqueville stresses. There are many, so it's just one. And you see, it's not just economic distance, it's space, geography, status, taxation, lack of common political space. He has interesting comments on that. Marriage gaps, I mentioned that before, and culturally established personal manners and habits, like habitus in Bourdieu's sense, and derogatory language. All these phenomena separate people in pre-revolutionary France, and this is part of the explanation of why he thinks there was a revolution in France in the first place, because I will come back to this at the end of my talk. So that's Tocqueville. Now I have introduced Tocqueville, I've introduced some of my main concepts. Now I want to give you 2 or 3 scenarios which are meant to help you to understand how I want to bring my concepts to life, how I want to apply them to real social life, right? It's one thing as a philosopher, we talk a lot about concepts and try to understand concepts, and it's another thing then to really see how you can work with them and how they can help you to analyze social reality. So now I need scenarios, what I call scenarios, which are meant to show you how I want to work with my categories, right? And here's one that became, for me, the starting point for the notion of empathy gulfs. It's by the American political scientist Ian Shapiro, and he has this is a long quote, but it's quite important to understand what I want to get at in the book. So Shapiro says this: it may just be impossible for the cleaners. He's talking about South Africa, Cape Town, a cleaning person in a very wealthy house, right? So that's the context. It may just be impossible for the cleaners to picture themselves ever owning such a car, let alone the houses in which their owners live. Their aspirations do not form in vacuums. People must be able to picture realistically the goods for which they will strive. If the gap between where a person is and where he or she might hope to be is too great, certain goods are likely to seem out of reach. There thus arises the possibility of an empathy gulf, a situation in which people who are situated in one stratum of society may find it literally impossible to imagine, we have imagination, the goods pursued by those in another. Yeah. So let me end the quote here. I think you get the situation. Now, I don't think that Shapiro is fully correct in describing this situation. Yeah, I will in the book in later chapters. I criticize him for some of the elements in this quote. But this is where I found the category of empathy gulfs. Yeah, so I read this and I thought that sounds interesting. I have to follow on that. I want to continue thinking about what does Shapiro mean by empathy gulfs. Here he means that people cannot imagine to live the life of a very rich person if they are very, very poor. And he thinks that has an influence on what they aspire for, what they want in life. If I cannot imagine even owning the car of this person, let alone the house, I will not aspire for the car or the house. I will I will adapt my desires, if you want, to my situation, not to this person's situation that lives such a different life from mine. That's Shapiro's idea, right? So in that sense, my whole imagination and what I strive for is bound to my status, if you like, and I cannot jump out of my status, even if I work in such a rich household. That's Shapiro. Again, I will not follow him in all respects. Yeah, but that's the empathy gulf in Shapiro. It's an inability to, in imagination, change position and develop, let's say, a certain desire for breaking out of your social status, for example. His idea is people don't. They stay within their status group. They don't go out in the streets and begin a revolution. This is what really interests him. Why are people so passive in a society that gets more and more unequal? And this is one of his explanations. He's saying they just can't imagine a different way of life. It's if the distance is too great, what they will be striving for is always closer to home, as it were. Which, by the way, I talk a lot about comparison in the book, which is my current research project, if I have time at all to do research, is who do we compare ourselves with, which is an interesting question. And social psychology seems to confirm the idea that we mostly compare in our neighborhood. Yeah, it's we don't strive too far away from where we are when we compare ourselves. Yeah. So if your colleague gets a better salary, that upsets you. If your boss or the CEO has 100 times more salary than you have, that won't upset you. It's just too far away. That's the idea here as well, right? There are in economics there are expressions for this, and in social psychology too. Yeah, you can think about this, but this is what Shapiro also suggests. So one scenario, and this was my starting point. This is where I found the category of empathy gulf. And I worked with it, and I think I developed it into further direction. Here's a second scenario, which is a bit strange maybe, but it's important for me to show you what I'm getting at. David Graeber, the now deceased anthropologist, has this scenario. It's a real-life situation that maybe you can all kind of understand and identify with. So he says this, and I quote, "Anyone who has ever worked in a restaurant kitchen knows that if something goes terribly wrong and an angry boss appears to size things up, he's unlikely to carry out a detailed investigation or even to pay serious attention to the workers, all scrambling to explain their version of what happened. He's much more likely to tell them all to shut up and arbitrarily impose a story that allows instant judgment, like, you, Joe, you wouldn't have made a mistake like that. You, Mark, you're the new guy. You must have screwed up. If you do it again, you're fired." So it's those, and now, so this is what Graeber imagines the situation to be. Something goes wrong in the kitchen, and the people trying to grapple with it, and then the boss comes in and without much thinking, just judges that X is wrong and Y is not wrong, and that. So that's what's happening. Now he adds, it's those, and this is important for my project, it's those who do not have the power to hire and fire, who are left with the work of figuring out what actually did go wrong. Whether one is dealing with masters and servants, men and women, employees and employers, rich and poor, structural inequality invariably creates highly lopsided structures of the imagination. And that's an interesting phrase, lopsided structures of imagination. By this, he means that the people in the kitchen, working in the kitchen or in the restaurant, they have to figure out what the boss actually meant by saying what he said. Whereas the boss, it seems, doesn't have to put in a lot of work in trying to figure out what went wrong. He's just making quick judgments. So this is what he means by lopsided structures of imagination. The poor ones or the dependent ones, they have to do the work, the labor in trying to imagine what did he mean by saying this or that. Yeah? So in unequal relationships, this imagination, this labor of imagination is unequally distributed. Yeah, the ones have to do a lot more than the others. That's an interesting idea, isn't it? And this is, as you can see, hopefully close to my topic, yeah, because it shows the relevance of imagination in structuring social relations and in upholding them. It's like a privilege not even having to imagine what someone says if you have the power to rescind from having to imagine what someone was doing or what someone meant. Whereas it's a sign here in this scenario of powerlessness if you have to put in the work of imagination, of figuring out what someone meant by what he said or what he did. So that's what he means by lopsided structures of the imagination. So I have more scenarios, but I will jump them because I don't have all the time that I would need to. So that's these scenarios are meant. These scenarios. Let me go back to this. These scenarios are meant again to bring my concepts alive and show that I can really work with them in analyzing social reality. So I am a philosopher. I'm not a sociologist, you know, but I can't do the sociology. But I can at least try to bring my concepts closer to social reality by using these scenarios. I have some reflections on methodology in my book, which I could always discuss with you because it's certainly in analytic philosophy, it's not very common to work with real life, you know, or let's say with scenarios close to real life. Yeah? This may not even be a real life scenario. Maybe he made it up. But I think it's pretty close to what all of us experience in unequal relationships of all kinds, by the way. Okay, let me now introduce further concepts. Back to philosophy. So feelings. I said imagination, feelings, inequality are the central concepts. I mostly work with what I call relative feelings. Relative feelings are feelings that structure social relations and mark social distance and differentiation. And you all know some of these relative feelings, like envy, contempt, shame, hatred, esteem, pride, admiration, love. These are all relative feelings. And by relative, I mean they relate us in a specific way to others. When I envy what you have, because you have something that I would like to have, but I don't have it, then I relate to you in a certain way. Yeah. When I feel ashamed of something I've done, I relate to the person, at least I imagine, that might have seen me, yeah, like in a typical situation of shame. Take other, you know, like a very prominent example today would be ressentiment, the French ressentiment, which many analysts use in trying to understand populism of right and left wing variants. In French literature, there are interesting books about the role of ressentiment as the one central category that might help us to understand populism. Yeah. So, and that is also a relative feeling, because if you spell out what ressentiment means, and people do that in the literature, it is a certain a negative feeling concerning some others in society. Let's say the elites. Yeah. You know all these discourses. So that's a relevant category in the book for me, relative feelings. I have a chapter on envy, which is a typical relative feeling. Now, my background, my normative background, if you like, is democratic. It's some idea of democratic equality. So again, here I borrow from Elizabeth Anderson. Again, I want to stress that inequality has economic dimensions, but inequality has more dimensions than that. Equality and inequality are also social relationships. So I want to understand equality and inequality in a much broader way than just in economic terms. Yeah, this I share with Anderson and with Pierre Rosanvallon, the French political theorist. I share another idea which brings again the relevance of imagination to the fore of my argument. He has this. He talks about imaginary equality. That's an unusual category. You know, I don't know if you've ever heard of imaginary inequality or equality. And what does he mean by it? he means by imaginary equality the ability to imagine yourself in the condition of every other individual and to identify with or even appropriate other people's stories. So that's sort of empathy again, yeah, in the description of what Rosan Vallon wants imaginary equality to be. It's the ability to change positions, and this is very demanding, you have to say, of every other individual. How would that be possible, right? Imagine yourself, but he means by this is strictly, I think, bound to an idea of democratic equality when we perceive ourselves or when we think about ourselves as democratic citizens. On a very basic level, there is an idea of we are all the same, normatively speaking. We should all have the same power, the same status as democratic citizens, right? And this, I think, maybe Rousseauian idea, Rosan Vallon turns into this idea that what this means is to be able to identify with or even appropriate other people's stories in the sense of I can be where they are if I put enough effort, let's say, into my education. Or so the goals. Remember Shapiro. What do I aspire for? Here, in a true democracy, and this is not a statement about how society really is. I think it's a normative statement, how it should be according to Rosan Vallon. If we perceive or identify ourselves as democratic citizens, we have to be able to sort of appropriate all or every other person's story. I will come back to this idea of appropriating another people's story. It's a difficult idea, I know, but I think it's interesting. It made me think a lot. So now here's I come to empathy and then to empathy gulfs, to the central category. I will not mention all of this, but what is, and this is a complex philosophical statement, but it's basically, it's Smith, it's Adam Smith just translated into modern empathy vocabulary. An empathic relation, as I take it to be, is a response in an imagination-based and active matching of feelings between two or more persons that contains evaluative judgments concerning the normative appropriateness of observed or contemplated responses to situations. Whew, that's a long one and not so easy, but it's easier than it seems. Now, if you think about Adam Smith in his theory of moral sentiments, he had lots of everyday situations and described them with his sympathy concept. Let's say you observe someone who responds to being treated unfairly, and this person is upset. Now, this is a typical scenario that Smith might use in the theory of moral sentiments, right? So you talk to this person, you see this person, and you see this person is upset. And if you sympathize with this person in Smith's way of dealing with sympathy, of treating sympathy, you share this feeling of being upset. Yeah, that's what the matching of feelings implies. You, in a way, have, if not the very same feeling, a similar feeling. If you do so, this indicates that you agree with the person that being upset is the adequate response to how this person was treated by a third person, say. Yeah, that's the contains evaluative judgments. So many of our emotional responses to situations have an evaluative dimension. Feelings are not just subjective, you know. Long time philosophy thought they were. We've learned a lot about feelings, and what we now know is that many of these feelings have a normative structure or an evaluative structure that shapes them in very relevant ways. So here in Smith, the idea is if I share your feeling, really share your feeling because I imagine what it must have been like for you to be treated in this negative way, then I'm also saying that your response to the situation is correct. It's appropriate, as Smith would say. Yeah, that's the notion of appropriateness. So it's not that complicated. Yeah, I think this happens a lot. Someone tells you something, and you follow, and you share, and you empathize, as we would say nowadays. This means that you accept that this person responded appropriately to, let's say, being treated unfairly. That's just what I mean. It's not more than that. So, it's a shared sensibility, and this is how I use the notion of empathy. Imagination does play a role. There are other accounts of empathy that get rid of imagination. For my account, I need imagination. I want it to be in there. And this is what I mean by imagination when it comes to empathy. I imagine what it must be like to be you, or I imagine how I would have responded in the situation. There are two variants here. I call this empathy, self-empathy, and other empathy, or have different expressions for that, because sometimes we really try to imagine what it must be like to be you, yeah. And sometimes I imagine how I would have responded if I was in the situation, right? And that's a different story there. And it's obviously quite difficult, couples know this very well, to really imagine what it must be like another person. It's a task, it's work, and we can fail. I will show we can fail in many ways, and that can hurt people, in fact. So that's empathy. Let me skip this imagination. I have philosophical ideas of imagination, but I skip them. The relevant point for me in talking about imagination is that imagination indicates that we're in different positions. We are separate persons. We need imagination to at least attempt to cross the bridge, if you want, and understand other people better than we usually do. So imagination indicates ontological separateness. It doesn't indicate that we merge. We don't become one. And Smith clearly says so. When he talks about sympathy, he says we have to sympathize with others because we are not one person. We are separate, and we always fail. It's never perfect, you know. So this is often overlooked in reading Smith. So in imagination, and the need for imagination indicates our separateness. Okay, but now empathy gulf. Let me now move to my most relevant category. Now, as you can imagine, I describe quite a lot of different empathy gulfs. I don't just Shapiro's example. Remember, the woman cleaning in the house was just one empathy gulf. I describe many others. So that's what I meant by saying I try to enlarge and try to add to Shapiro's category of empathy gulf. And I just list now some of the ways that I want to talk about empathy gulfs. Yeah. So these are things that can happen. And again, I think some of my vocabulary here is quite complex, but in reality, I think the situations that I work with are pretty everyday. They're not so outlandish to be weird or made up or just constructed. Let me begin with a very common phenomenon. This is what I call relational empathic disparity. This happens when I don't feel what you feel. Yeah? Let's say you are upset about someone, and I think you are totally overblown in your response to the situation. I think you exaggerate. The person hasn't treated you as badly as you think. So I don't share feelings. This is empathy for Smith, by the way. It's not non-empathy, it's empathy. Because I try to switch positions. I try to maybe imagine being you or how I would respond in this situation. And my result is, I don't think that your response is correct. I think you are totally out of your mind. You're making up the hurt. So calm down. You know, we do that. You know these conversations, yeah. And that is empathy, but it's empathy that leads to disagreement and maybe even to criticism, right? Smith, in the theory of moral sentiments, he has this figure of the impartial spectator helping me sort of to find out what is adequate in a situation. What would be the adequate response to some unfair treatment? Yeah. So in Smith, I can always, as it were, consult the impartial spectator, who is, impartial in a certain way. We can discuss that, and tells me this would have been the adequate response to this kind of behavior or that kind of behavior. Therefore, my judgment that your response is, let's say, exaggerated, it's not just my subjective impression. I base my judgment on consulting or on referring to the impartial spectator. The impartial spectator, as it were, is present in me. Another indication, by the way, of the fact that when I talk about feelings or the whole emotional side to social relations, I'm not talking about merely subjective states of the body or of mind, because the impartial spectator is if you want, a person or a figure that is shared by many people, according to Smith. It's not just my private own impartial spectator. Ideally, we share the same voice coming from the impartial spectator. So this happens, right? Relational empathicness. I don't feel what you feel. I disagree. I criticize you, or I tell you, calm down, you know, in this example. Now, a different phenomenon is non-relational empathic disparity. This is maybe Shapiro's example. The distance is just too great, and I cannot imagine what it must be like to be you. My imaginative labor, remember, fails. So in that way, maybe what I do then, I don't judge, at all. I cannot, I'm sorry, I don't know what's going on here. I'm too far from you. Your situation is not really familiar to me. So there is a disparity, and several things can happen. And what often happens if this imaginative labor fails, maybe I put in some imaginative labor, but I fail. What then often happens is something I call imputational empathy. Well, maybe then I just imagine what you feel without really being correct. Because I can't do the work, or I fail, or it's too difficult for me, I just think, oh, well, maybe this is what you really feel. This is what I call imputational empathy, which is tricky because I seem to empathize with you, but I'm wrong. I really am not. But it's easy to overlook. I come back to that point. Another, and this is it, then I mention it, imputational empathy. I think I feel what you feel, but I don't, right? I impute my feeling to you. It's a hidden empathy gulf. We don't know. This happens a lot, I think, even in everyday relations. Yeah, it's the most tricky category, I think. I think I know what you feel. It seems we are in the same boat, as it were. We really aren't, but we don't notice. Yeah, we don't notice the gulf, but it's there. Maybe at a later point we find out, oh, we have not been in the same boat, but it's difficult to find out. Yeah. So sometimes what happens is that we just project our feelings to the other and think that the way we respond or would have responded to a situation is the correct one, and we think that you actually did respond like I think you did. And there, I mean, here's a strong, from a literary critic, Hartmann says, this is the obliteration of otherness, meaning that, if you project your own feelings onto someone else, this person disappears as a different person, as other, right? So, but I'm not going into detail here. And then another category is the obvious empathy gulf. That's when I don't want to imagine being you. Yeah, this also happens. We don't want to put in any imaginative labor because we completely disagree with who you are or what you stand for. Yeah, it's like in Germany, some people say you can't empathize with Hitler. It's impossible. You don't. For moral reasons, you will not do so because you think he was a deeply evil person, and there's no way you can empathize, in my sense of using the notion of empathy, with such evil persons. Yeah, we have like a resistance to imagine being an evil person, so we don't do it. Yeah, we can do that. Sometimes we don't want to put in any labor in trying to imagine being someone else in order to develop maybe an empathic relation, because we think the other person is just so far beyond anything that we consider morally adequate that we find even the attempt to want to understand this person despicable, right? So it's like even wanting to empathize here is taken to be wrong by, let's say, by society. Okay. Now I have many different applications of the concept of empathy gulfs. I'm not going, I don't want to mention all of them, but this is one that I find very relevant here. So before moving to the last part of my lecture, I want to mention it. There's also, and this is very prominent in Smith and in Hume, empathy with the privileged. There's a power-based empathy gulf. And this is maybe the situation that David Graeber had in mind. Yeah, the lopsided imagination structures. In feminism, there's an interesting debate by the American philosopher Kate Mann in her book Down Girl. She describes situations in which she calls it himpathy. It's an interesting category, where she thinks that there is an excessive sympathy with male perpetrators of sexual violence. She's discussing cases of rape. And she studied some of these procedures, legal procedures, and she found that quite a lot of people involved in these legal procedures sympathized with the perpetrator of the crime and not with the victim. And she calls that himpathy. It's an interesting category. It is a kind of a sympathy. She thinks it's a wrong sympathy, but it is still sympathy in our sense of the word sympathy, and says this is strange because empathy has, it's not, we don't empathize with just anyone. As a sociologist, you might study the various forms of the structures that shape who we empathize with and who we don't empathize with. And that's what empathy is. Empathy is the willingness to sort of do your imaginative labor in a very one-sided way. You concentrate on one group of persons, let's say males, and not on other groups of persons. In this case, very often women. And that's something she found in reading some of these documents from legal procedures. It's an interesting category, also relevant to my research. Okay, now I'm coming to the last part of my talk. Now I was talking about distances, right? And I mentioned several distances in the book. I describe at length some of the distances relevant in their effect on empathy, the distances that create empathy gulfs. Yeah? I mentioned mere geographic or spatial or temporal distances. So you can imagine if someone lives in a gated community, this person will find it difficult to empathize with someone who doesn't live in a gated community. Tocqueville has ideas about geographic gulfs or distances, quite a lot, actually. Or Smith has an example of an earthquake in China, says we cannot really sympathize with people in China, just too far away, right? So even Smith, in talking about sympathy, admits that sympathy has a certain structure, and we sympathize more with some people than with others. It's easier to sympathize with people near us than with people far away, right? So these differentiations within the notion of sympathy were already present in Smith. I didn't make them up. So lots of other sympathy distances, just to mention some others. I mentioned structural sexism as a distance, making it difficult to empathize in my use of the notion empathy. You can have interesting, let me go back here. The book starts with a quote from Caparrós, I think an Argentinian journalist who written a great book on hunger, El Hambre. The first example is how he talks to a woman in Africa, a very poor woman, who's one of her boys just died from malnutrition, and then he asks her, imagine you had a magic wand, and you could wish for anything to come true, anything. Just what would you wish for? If you've read it, she says, "Oh, I would want to have one cow," and then Caparrós says, "No, anything." He's thinking like not just one cow. I mean, and then she thinks again and says, "Oh, well, really anything? Oh, 2 cows, right?" And he said, and then it's interesting, and then maybe I read it. It's a great quote, but it's what I'm trying to get at. He sort of understands how far away he was from this woman, from the reality of this woman, because then he, at the end he says, so she says 2 cows, and then he says she said this in a whisper, then explained with 2, then I'd really never be hungry, and then he adds, it was so little, I thought at first. Only later did I realize that it was so much for her, right? So that's what I'm trying to analyze in the book. He wasn't able to really imagine what it must be like to be her, and why 1 cow or even 2 cows was so much to her, not to him, coming from a different background. So it's an interesting distance there. There are many distances, and malnutrition or lack of basic nutritional provision obviously can distance you from people who do not experience this lack. And that's what this quote shows so well. What this distance, again, you see, has an impact on our ability to empathize, on our ability to imagine being the other, and will have then also an impact on how we judge a situation. So that's my take on the topic. So let me go back to Tocqueville, and I think I should finish here, and then we can have the comments and maybe discuss. What is, if what I describe as empathy gulfs are real, if you think, okay, it makes sense, it's an interesting category, it exists, these gulfs exist, and what's problematic about it? You could just say, well, okay, I mean, we're separate. I said so myself. We're separate people. We have different stories. We have different, narratives. Each one has his or her own life. Of course, there are many distances, and we live here, we live there. We are rich, we are poor, all fine. Maybe it's true that we don't manage to empathize in the way you think it may be important to do or be able to do. What's problematic about it? What did Tocqueville, and so I return to Tocqueville, what did Tocqueville find problematic about these distances that he describes, particularly in the book on the French Revolution? And this is interesting. I mean, it's a book on a revolution, right? So it's obviously about something important going on in France, in 18th century France. So it was not just a minor, societal change that he was describing. He was describing one of the most massive changes in, let's say, European history. And the book, in part, tries to explain how it happened and why it happened. And the typical explanation, like if you read the preface of the introduction of John Elster, he's focusing on this Tocqueville effect, which you may know, which says that, interestingly enough, when people's situation improves, they start to rebel or to revolutionize much more so than when their situation remains the same or when it worsens. So Tocqueville noticed that in France, I mentioned this, by and large, the situation in the 18th century France, the situation for many people became better, improved. And for him, this is the reason why the revolution took place. So this paradoxical model is, if a situation is improved, coming from worse to better, is potentially more dangerous than staying bad, or even things getting worse. And the idea seems to be that if I realize that my situation can be changed, and improvement means change, I can sort of realize that what I've experienced so far is not all, that there is an alternative to my present life. So improvement in that sense, according to Tocqueville, can be quite dangerous if you adopt the position, let's say, of the absolutist French king of 18th century, So that's what Elsa focuses on in trying to explain Tocqueville's model of the revolution. But I think Tocqueville had a lot more to say in the book about the factors leading to the revolution. It wasn't just that improving the situation creates a desire to even further improve it, even the desire to completely revolutionize society. He has more to say. And And this is interesting, and I think this gives you an answer of why he thinks that empathy gulfs, in my sense, are dangerous for a society. And maybe this is evident to you. We talk a lot about, populism nowadays, and about people living in their bubbles, the online bubbles, the social media bubbles. So we talk a lot about these distances and the inability to take the United States right now, to cross the bridge and to empathize with others. So this is present in Tocqueville, I think. His idea is, for example, and I give you an example. I said I would mention the taxing question that Tocqueville talks a lot about. Now, Tocqueville thinks that the king, in 18th century France, at some point granted tax privileges to some of the nobles, right? So they enjoyed tax privileges. They didn't have to pay a certain kind of tax that all others had to pay. And Tocqueville says this granted privilege created in the noble an immediate and urgent need to differentiate himself from the masses. But it's interesting. So even though the situation grew more similar for all people, I mentioned this at the beginning, this measure of the government created distance between groups of people. Yeah, a tax privilege created distance, and of course the peasants, the third estate, if you want, they noticed these privileges and they despised the nobles for having them, right? So immediately you have a political measure that brings distance between people, even though objectively speaking, they have grown more similar in many respects. This is one aspect. And obviously he finds that problematic. This tendency to isolate, to socially isolate, he finds problematic. Why so? Quite difficult. This is an interesting quote for all Tocqueville scholars, I assume. It's from the book on the French Revolution. It's on the idea of what a liberal society would look like. And here he says, liberty forced all classes to maintain contact with one another so that when necessary, they could find common ground. That's a strange, I find it a difficult statement. Why so? What does he mean? Liberty forced all classes to maintain contact? Well, his idea seems to be it's easier to accept mutual relatedness and the need mutual relatedness and mutual need. So to realize that we all hang together in a certain way in our society, it's easier to do so in a liberal society or free society than in a society where government acts induce what he calls artificial separations. This is an interesting philosophical idea. The idea that the separations induced by government through, for example, tax measures, separate people in a way that makes it much more difficult to overcome these separations than if people were truly free, or in a society where government would not implement certain measures to privilege groups or to disprivilege other groups. In a free or liberal society, the need for each other, or so says Tocqueville, is easier to realize and to implement than in a society with a strong government. I'm not saying that I follow him here, but I think I try to understand what he means, right? So in that sense, what he thinks was lacking in pre-revolutionary France was a notion of common citizenship and a notion of common humanity. I said this before. And this led then, this is the last slide, to what he calls mutual isolation and estrangement, and to the fact that when the revolution occurred, the king and his circle did not have any relevant social class that would help them or support them. The nobles were isolated, the peasants were isolated, the bourgeoisie was isolated. That's Tocqueville's idea. And so nobody came to help when, let's say, the peasants started the revolution or the bourgeoisie fought for its interests. There was just no common ground. And these separations of classes led to this phenomenon of estrangement. And this also implies the inability to switch positions and to imaginatively switch positions. And this is one other cause, I think, of the revolution in Tocqueville. So it's quite momentous of what he, this element of social groups getting more and more isolated from each other is for Tocqueville, I think, an additional explanation of why the revolution took place. It's not an exact explanation of why it took place. I think what it does explain is why the event itself is sort of, I mean, the revolution has to be an indication of some, you know, how shall I say, of some massive distance between groups of persons, between classes, if you want. What else is a revolution? I mean, one class saying we are not one common humanity, we're not one common citizenship or citizenry. So that's, I think, on an, if you want, on an effective level, what made the revolution possible. So I stop here, and I'm curious for the comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. So we will have a brief conversation with you and Leonidas, and then we will open the floor for your questions. So let me perhaps open the fires. And reading your book and listening to your presentation, it's unavoidable to think in this very, very strong idea in Tocqueville's, which state that the feeling of inequality is hurts the most as long as inequality reduces, isn't it? I mean, when you are in a very unequal society, following your words, you cannot imagine the distance, so you cannot feel any hurt. Nevertheless, as long as the societies become in the American democracy less unequal, Tocqueville says that the minimum difference hurts you a lot. Okay, so I would like to ask you about this idea and how it relates with your thesis. And an embedded question on that is that as long as societies become more equal, and so the minimum, the most minimum difference in inequality hurts you more, you can have like two reactions. One is envy, okay, or angry. Nevertheless, you can also have like an empathy on the causes behind this inequality. I mean, if you are talking about material inequality, my neighbor is doing better than I, so I can feel jealous. But I can empathize and understand what are the reasons why he became richer. And so my second question has to do with this idea you mentioned of social gulfs, I mean class gulfs, which is a kind of wall impeding you to empathize with the reasons behind this level of wealth that is deployed.
Well, just, you want me to answer now?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think see, you were mentioning, what you mentioned was sort of, I begin with the last question, the Shapiro example, right? The person in the wealthy house doing the cleaning. Now, here's where I disagree with Shapiro, and I said I do not follow him in all respects. I think, I mean, if you work in a house, you see that, you know, the person you work for is richer, and you see a nice car or whatever, you know, it's, why should you not be able to imagine, I don't know, having a nice car? I mean, after all, you work there every day. And if David Graeber is right, you have to do, you know, to get along with this person, you may have to do a lot of imaginary labor in the sense of understanding, what does he mean by this kind of command, what by that? Is this cleaning all right, or should I clean it better, or should I clean it differently? So in that sense, I think Shapiro is wrong. He overestimates, I think, the impact of this distance on people's imagination. What I think is a better description of the situation is, you cannot imagine how you yourself would ever manage to get to this stage. So it's a social question. you may very well be able to, I mean, you can read magazines, you can watch films about wealthy people, and I think Hume and Smith, with their category of, you know, sympathy with the rich, they have an idea about this. They tend to think that we sympathize with the rich. We like it to imagine being rich, so we can do it. Yeah, we can do it. It's not so difficult. But what we can't do, and this is my reading, is to imagine how we would get there. Because, objectively speaking, we can't very often, because the structures are too harsh for us, or with our background, or with our lack of, you know, networks, connections, education, you name it. It's just impossible to get there unless we are very, very lucky, let's say. So that's how I think that Shapiro is wrong about the situation. He's right about it, and he's wrong about it at the same time. Yeah. So that's I think that the problem of inequality here is not so much on the imaginative level, but on imagining how you would do it, how you would accomplish it. You don't imagine people helping you. You don't imagine. It's just you stick to home, as I said, in comparing yourself. So that may have an impact on your dreams, on your wishes, and so you don't even wish for becoming so rich because you sort of know it's impossible. So why would you spend a lot of time on imagining what it must be like to get there? The first question, I'm not sure if I understood what you meant. Tocqueville says, and you're right, in an equal or more equal society, the small differences then become very important. They matter a lot. And I mean, we don't live, I'm not sure about Chile, but you can tell me, I mean, we don't live in societies becoming more equal. We live in societies becoming more unequal. So I could just easily answer, I could make it my answer easy and say, this is not the society we live in. And I'm more dealing here with the inequalities than with the more equal society. But still, I grant your question. I understand that Tocqueville has this idea of the small differences then becoming very important. And so if you have a nice house, you have one car, but your neighbor has a nice house and has two cars, let's say. I might get envious, right? Or jealous, whatever. And this is the narcissism, at what Freud called the narcissism of small differences, right? I want also a second car. And economically speaking, there are interesting studies confirming that position. It's apparently, if you're really well, if you're doing well, it's also quite a stressful situation, but because you compare to other people who are also doing well, but maybe even better, slightly better. But I think I mean, that may happen, and I wouldn't deny that that is an interesting phenomenon, but I'm interested, I would want to offer you another scenario, which I think is more interesting, because there is sociological research on very wealthy people and on how they understand their own situations. I quote a sociologist from the New School who interviewed very wealthy New York millionaires, really wealthy people, yeah, and how do they relate to other people? Who do they empathize with? Why do they think they have, become so rich? And what happens here is that these people often downplay the distance between them and other social strata. You find quotes saying, "Oh well, compared to African people in the United States, we're all wealthy." So see, that's an interesting trick. I call this false similarity. You pretend that the differences within the United States, within New York, let's say New York society, are not so big. If you choose another comparison, another point of reference, namely an extremely poor society, say, and compared to that, we're all in one boat. Many of these millionaires downplay the dissimilarities between them and other social strata in the United States. So they create a false similarity, and this is kind of an empathy gulf because it overlooks the real distances that are there and that are given and that have an impact on people's lives and prospects. So it's quite problematic, I think. So I think that's, for me, that is more relevant than the small differences that Tocqueville describes. About Tocqueville, it's interesting that he says in a democracy or in a more equal society, people can immediately imagine being the other. That, again, I find interesting as an idea, and I think Rosanvallon follows him in his account of imaginary equality. It's difficult to understand what exactly they mean. It's not an easy idea, But as a democratic citizen, this is how I translate this idea into my terminology. You at least, on a very basic level, have to have the impression that all people are treated equally in political terms, have the same voice, in having political influence, etc. And so there are various levels of equality here, and in, even in common life, we have means to converse and talk to people who are very distant in social terms. So there's another level of equality that might be important, and that I find interesting. I think Tocqueville meant that in a positive way, and the remaining distances through exaggerating small differences, I don't know how problematic he found them. You can study the phenomenon, it may exist. I don't think it's for our society the most relevant phenomenon.
Thank you, Martin, for your presentation, for your book, of course. And ahora sí. And in the last probably 30 years, philosophers have been paying a lot of attention to sympathy as the concept developed by Hume and improved by Adam Smith in many ways, as you know. And as you mentioned in the beginning, there is a long tradition of what it really meant, sympathy. It was used in the medical research in the 17th century. Atkinson mentioned the word and all that. But Hume considers sympathy as a mean of communication, something contagious. I mean, feelings were transmitted within society and within individuals in society. And in that sense, what Smith did is he moved another step forward, creating this concept of mutual sympathy, which is when you put in the shoes of the other and you reach that level of connection that is not only a contagious feeling, but involves another process. I mean, to put it simply, sympathy is the same word as compassion. I mean, one is Greek and the other is Latin. And to feel compassion is very easy. I mean, somebody would cry and I would feel compassion. If somebody's laughing, I will laugh and I will probably share that feeling, that fellow feeling. But for Smith, mutual sympathy required not only sharing that feeling, but knowing the circumstances or the motivation that would trigger that feeling, which is also a rational process. That there was a process of deliberation at the same time. So, as I like to say, it was the best heart joined with the best head. I mean, not only feelings. And in that sense, he was very realistic, as you mentioned, with the example of the earthquake, claiming that it's easier to sympathize with yourself, he would say, as the concentric circles, with my family, with my friends. And there is one stage that sympathy will definitely almost disappear. And that's the market, probably. And my question is that, I mean, because he would talk of the market as a market of strangers, okay? Do you see any role for sympathy within the market?
Well, that's the old Adam Smith problem, you know, and I've written a whole text on that. It's not in the book, and because how do you relate the wealth of nations to the theory of moral sentiments? That's the big discussion that has, kept us people busy. I think you can give a positive answer. I think if you read certain passages in the Wealth of Nations and in the lectures on jurisprudence, you find passages in which it is clear that market individuals or people acting within what Smith calls commercial society are not just narrow, egotists, or just, as we would say today, rationally centered happiness maximizers or whatever, meaning their own happiness, utility maximizers. You can see that he assumes that to act on a market, I mean, very often you have to, for example, you have to imagine what people would like to buy. So the baker selling bread has to figure out what bread might be good for people. What bread? Certainly, if there's competition, we have to develop maybe a better bread than your neighboring baker. So in that sense, there's imagination involved in, I mean, this may be a very loose sense of what I call imagination, you know, but I think it's possible. There is an other directedness in market activity. It's not just self-centeredness and self-directedness. You have to figure out what people would want to buy, or what people might find, you know, of utility to them. That's one aspect. And another aspect is the impartial spectator. In the Wealth of Nations, you don't find the impartial spectator. That's too sad. We would have liked to see it there, right? But it's not there. But in the Theory of Moral Sentiment, it's all over the place. So why? It's strange. He didn't link it. But I think, in a way, there are some passages in the Theory of Moral Sentiments where you can see that he's also suggesting that, I mean, the impartial spectator has to condone activities on markets. The impartial spectator is not just relevant for, you know, narrowly moral agency or action. It's also relevant to condone the behavior on markets. So the impartial spectator might tell you not to betray people on a market, not to lie to people or to bribe them or to be corrupt. And these are moral recommendations the impartial spectator might express if you listen to the impartial spectator, which, of course, according to Smith, you should. It depends a bit on how much you moralize the figure. But so in that sense, all kinds of human activity need approval from the impartial spectator, including commercial activity. In that sense, you can say that for Smith, behavior on markets is not chaotic, it's not anarchic, it's not necessarily completely egotistic. It does have this component of other directedness, and it has this component of having to be acceptable to the voice of the impartial spectator. And what is this voice? What is it? I mean, we can talk a lot about that, but among other things, of course, it's the voice of, let's say, common decency that we as a society can sort of accept and expect of each other. Whatever else the impartial spectator is, I guess you can say that's part of what it is, and it may have stronger roles to play, sometimes even up to, you know, being a theological figure. But I wouldn't go so far here. So it's enough to say that commercial society needs a moral frame, and I think here you can link Smith 1 and Smith 2, right? And he is critical of certain inequalities stemming from markets. In the lectures on jurisprudence, he has interesting passages on poverty and on how problematic poverty is, etc. And so I think it is possible to link.
Fair and deliberate exchanges.
Yeah. Yes.
We will open the floor for questions. Let me just ask a last one, a very small one. What's your view about the role of civil society, the one that Tocqueville emphasized in breaking the wall, avoiding sympathy to be shared, empathy to be shared?
Yeah. I think it's very relevant, and I mean, if we need, I mean, I said geography plays a role, even architecture in Tocqueville. It's interesting, he mentioned so many phenomena that separate us, but if we did better, wouldn't separate us. And one aspect is, for example, we need common spaces. We need spaces to get together. And we met yesterday. And we had dinner. I may say so, I hope. And we talked about soccer, the role of soccer bringing people together of different classes and strata, right? We need architectural spaces where people can get together. In Germany, many malls, you know, have no benches. You know, you cannot sit there because the commercial people fear homeless people to just, you know, stay there because it's warm if it's inside, and they don't want that to happen. They want these people outside. But even you, as a normal shopper, let's say, you want to sit down every now and then and relax. I'm not a good shopper, but if I go at all, every now and then I need to rest. And then there is no place where you can rest and maybe even meet people or talk to people. We need spaces where we can meet each other. And civil society, if it's alive and intact, offers these spaces in clubs, the whole social capital literature, in sports clubs, in other ways of associating and gathering. Today, I read an interesting article from a Swiss newspaper. The Tour de France, is a massive, of course, sports event. And a lot of local communities in France apply for being chosen for the tour to pass through their town. Every little town in France wants the Tour de France to pass through their little town. It's an honor and brings lots of tourists, and so they may also have an economic effect. But interestingly, some research suggests that in these communities that actually manage to be chosen by the organizers of the Tour de France, populists have less support. It's a sort of a crazy correlation. I don't know if it's a causality there or just a correlation, but it's interesting. So because Tour de France is an event that brings people together of very different stripes and classes. So again, another example of why civil society is so important. And the big question, of course, is, can there be a civil society online? The whole social media question. I'm skeptical. So I think we need spaces of this kind in the real world. I mean, the real world, I know the online world is also real, so, but you know what I mean, in the analog world, whatever. And there's a problem if we don't have these spaces. Because if you have them, I mean, the approval rates also of democracy are much higher. Switzerland, for example, is still quite a stable democracy. It does have a very powerful populist party, if you want. It's quite successful, the most powerful party. But it's integrated in coalition systems. This is the whole system. It's a bit complex to explain. But at the same time, Switzerland has a very vibrant, I would say, civil society in folklore, in sports, in other kinds of activity, and I think that helps. Just to give you a last example, we are all, most of us here, or some of us here, are professors. We have titles. In Austria, have you ever been to Austria? Professors are always called Professor Dr. Hartmann, and it's shown. I mean, they really, and now as a president of my university, they even have different ways of approaching you and calling you. I find that strange, but anyway. So they pay a lot of attention to social status, right? And to your professional status. And that introduces distinctions immediately between you and the people. In Switzerland, people don't do that. They don't even mention the doctor, the title. They call you by your first name very frequently and very quickly. It's maybe I'm speculating, and that's another means to say, and that's what I mean by democratic equality. Maybe that's a good example of what I was talking about democratic equality. Let's not stress differences, let's stress commonalities. And it may sometimes be hypocritical, it may sometimes make it difficult to really analyze given differences, because Switzerland is also a society with very, very wealthy individuals and quite a lot of people who have not as much, or not anywhere close to as much. There's poverty, there's homelessness. So I'm not saying it's totally perfectly, I mean, it's acceptable that all that the distances are not talked about. We need to talk about them, but it's important to have means to sometimes to bridge them, to stay sort of related to each other.
Great. Vamos a abrir preguntas. Si quiere alguien preguntar. ¿Con micrófono? ¿Sin micrófono? Así nomás. O alta. ¿Sí? Ahí usted le llega uno.
Thank you very much. Very interesting talk. I was thinking about how the feeling of inequality also becomes a feeling of injustice. And then you can develop more than imagination, or a critical imagination. I was thinking about that. It's not only I cannot I will not have that car, but the structures are injustice. And Marx already saw that as a possibility. And the second is something that we are talking about now. I am working currently on propaganda, and it's selective empathy. And it's part of affective polarization. I mean, people who have empathy, but just for one group.
Yeah.
And it's because so my question is also like how we can think empathy obstruct by ideology, for example.
We
Well,
will
that-
take a
okay.
group of two more questions. If anybody has one. ¿Alguna otra pregunta? Vamos a juntar 2 o 3 preguntas para que el profesor responda.
Hi, very interesting. It was related a bit on the previous one, and it's related to the attribution of causes of the inequality, how it relates to your empathy gulf. It's embedded within it. So if I say I'm rich and I think the poor are lazy versus the poor are feeling due to injustice, how does it relate, or whether it's included?
One more question. Wow. Acá, ya. Bien. Dale tú, Ma.
It's two small questions. One is, it seems that the theory assumes a level of emotional maturity that I'm not sure if people have. It assumes that people are able to feel, name, and express emotions. So I was wondering if you have thought about that. And the other question that I had is, what happened when this category, like you say the goal is to reduce distances from 2 points, but what if the categories are shifting all the time, like class or race, which are changing because they are socially constructed, where, like how people will know where to put themselves to reduce that distance?
Martin.
Well, I have to remember all questions. Maybe the social justice. In the book, I don't talk a lot about justice and injustice. That's true. What I do talk, I mean, that's just my choice of topic. What I do talk about is, and I mentioned this when I mentioned the phenomenon of creating false similarity. I mentioned the rich New Yorkers, right? Suggesting that they're not so different from other people in America by choosing a pretty absurd third reference point. And if that works, what it does is it makes it difficult to criticize social injustice because you don't see it. You don't see that the situation of some people being so rich and the situation of many other people not being so rich as unjust. So what I do describe, I don't talk a lot about social injustice, but I talk about mechanisms that might make it difficult to criticize injustice. And denying given differences, socioeconomic differences, is one means to do that, to make it difficult to criticize social injustice. You can see the same, and this is your second point, in, when I talked about empathy. I think that's basically what you were also referring to, the selective empathy. Yeah, we don't just empathize with anybody. We empathize with people we feel are close to us, as part of what you mentioned. And this causes many problems. And in empathy, as I said, is the problem that very frequently in rape proceedings, there's more sympathy geared toward the male perpetrator of the crime than the mostly female victim. But then again, if you read some of these texts, and I did read a book by, the famous John Krakauer, who wrote this famous book about the Mount Everest catastrophe. So he wrote a book about a university in the United States. The book is called Missoula, and where a lot of football players have been involved in rape culture. And so he attended, and then at some point there was some women, at least after a long, long time, standing up and blaming these football players and the structures that led to silencing these kinds of crime. So there were legal proceedings in the end. And then he quotes a father of one of these football players who of course is totally sympathetic with his son, the perpetrator, but he has a daughter as well. And then some prosecutor asks him, well, imagine it's your daughter. Imagine your daughter is the one being raped. What would you do? And then he says, oh, that's completely different. It's he's saying, I wouldn't compare the situation of my daughter to the situation of this particular woman that is now the victim in this case, because it's my daughter, and of course I would totally sympathize with my daughter. So he's showing selective sympathy, but at the same time, he's not seeing that there's a structural element to this, namely that most of the victims are women, and that his daughter could very well be the victim. And that could be a means to relate his daughter's situation to the situation of this woman involved in this process, in these legal proceedings. So he's saying, he's denying a relation that is objectively there by just saying, oh, of course I would be sympathetic if my daughter was involved in a violation like this. So again, that there is a larger injustice does not become visible through this kind of selective empathy. So again, I'm not talking so much about social injustice, but I'm interested in some of the phenomena that make it difficult to criticize unjust. So at least in this indirect way, injustice is present in the book. Okay. Now your first question about the maturity, I did not quite understand. In what context?
No, because I think in order to feel empathy, or you need to understand, you need to identify the feeling and then understand and be able to express it.
So you think that some people are not capable of empathy in this quite complex manner that I suggest?
Maybe.
I don't know. If you take Smith as an example, the way he talks about sympathy, I think he clearly thinks that it's an everyday phenomenon. We all more or less sympathize in his sense of sympathy with people by just sharing their feelings or not sharing them, and that's something I think that is very common. I don't think that we have to be very sophisticated or sophisticated individuals to do that. We all, sometimes say things like, "Oh, I feel with you, I understand you, I'm sorry for you." If it's compassion, that is even stronger. I suffer with you. So I don't think that's so far-fetched and requires very, complex psychological capacity. So that's at least how I also would like to use the term empathy. I think it's, again, it's not an emotion itself. Maybe if I treated it, if it was an emotion, then we might have, people who lack capacity to empathize, as we, psychologists and neuroscientists discuss these phenomena, people who are totally incapable of feeling with, pathological sociopaths. Sometimes we think lack feelings almost, But that's not how I use the term empathy. Again, that's why I stress that it's not a feeling itself. It just as I said, it translates feelings, and that I think we all do. Like like in Smith, the theory of moral sentiments begins. It's a famous beginning with the scene of torture, and so Hume even thinks that you can. David Smith even thinks that you can sympathize with the torturer. So you see how neutral he almost uses the term. It's not itself morally valuable to be able to sympathize. You can do it, and you do it, he thinks, and it's not itself morally laudable to do it, because in the end, there has, some people have been saying that even the torturer has to be quite imaginative in his dealings, because the better you know someone, the better you can torture him, right? So So this is how far you can go in, getting rid of, strong moral connotations of the term sympathy or empathy.
Aunque estamos bien pasado el tiempo, demos espacio para una pregunta más y cerramos. Así que una solamente. Al fondo. Last question.
Thank you for your talk. Very interesting. I want to be a little bit more pessimistic in the sense of like reducing distance will drive us to a better place, because I'm thinking on the process of immigration in general, like in Chile, like the elite is very far away from immigrants. And they are the one that approve the illegal immigration and immigration in general, while the people that are living closer to them, more the masses, let's say, they seem to really be like the ones that are pushing for an anti-immigrant. And maybe they understand them, they can see the world a little bit like them because they live very similarly, but they seem to be right. I don't know what will be the exact word, like the opposite of empathy, not neutral, but more like imagining the worst version of those people. So I'm wondering how do you see this? Do you see a tipping point or something like that?
Yeah, there's this, I think they call it contact hypothesis, right? If you experience, let's say, migrants, your attitude changes in a more positive way. And whereas like in Germany, for example, in East Germany, people are very critical of migration, but you have hardly any migrants there. In the West, there are many more. Yeah, and so if you're right, this contact hypothesis saying that sharing experiences or sharing spaces with migrants changes your view into a positive might not be true. And you also have like Cubans in the US voting for Trump and not wanting more migration, or even Latinos voting for Trump, not wanting more migration. That's why. I mean, they should be closer. They should be much more, as you say, they should be much better equipped to this switch in this imaginary switch, because they themselves may have been in this similar situation. I guess there are sociological explanations of this. I haven't read them, so I can't really. I guess there is a gulf that is there, a surprising gulf that we don't expect, but I guess there are explanations for it. Maybe the idea is, I've managed. Through, let's say, through my own effort, I managed to reach a certain status in the United States. And you don't want this to be endangered by even more migrants, or you think they're too lazy, they can't do it. Maybe you develop then this kind of what I call imputational empathy. You forget about your own past, as it were, and you're full of stereotypical images of these people, even though you could know better. I don't know. I'm sorry, I don't have very good explanations for this, but it's true and a bit frustrating, as you say, that this seems to be a common phenomenon, that people who once were in a situation but have left it sort of forget about having ever been in the situation. Maybe there's a psychologist here who can explain this a little better. I don't know. I find this weird because my gut reaction would be that should lead to sympathy with, let's say, migrants. Yeah, maybe when politicians use some of these stereotypes to describe migrants and their attitudes, maybe you always think, okay, that's not me any longer. They're not talking about me. They're talking about them. And if you have this distinction between us and them, that is sort of an empathy gulf. Always, I'd say. So maybe what we see here is the success. Someone was talking about propaganda earlier on. Yeah, Jason Stanley has this book, And he defines propaganda, the effects of propaganda, almost by saying it succeeds in creating empathy, what I call empathy gulfs between people, because it creates an us and a them, and it creates a chasm, a gulf between both groups. And then you are full of stereotypical images and narratives of these other people. And maybe what we experience nowadays is that some of these narratives are quite successful, even among the people who should know better. So various explanations.
Okay, great. So with this, we are closing. Thank you, Leonida. Thank you, Martin, for this wonderful presentation. And I ask you to provide a big applause to Professor Hartmann.
Thank you. Thank you. Oh, you're welcome.
Bueno,
Oh, yeah.
I really like the book by